Hi everyone, welcome to our Museum Mondays in March. This month we will be celebrating fashion, and I feel so lucky that I get to start and tell everybody about one of my favorite eras of fashion in the 1800s. We decided to stick to the 1800s. Originally I had wanted to do 1800s up until today, and I was told that that might be a little bit much to cover on our museum lives. But we're going to start with 1800, go until about 1900, and try and tell you all about different topics in between, including where fabric would come from that made some of these new fashions and whatnot for the people who lived at this time. So today we get to start with the Regency era, and I wanted to first kind of talk about what was going on historically at that time, and then we'll get into, you know, what it looks like, the silhouette of the outfit and everything. So the Regency era, it's called that because the Prince Regent actually was the one running the show, if you will, in England at the time. What that meant was that the king was incapacitated in some way. In this case, some people say he went mad, some people say that maybe he had memory issues, and at the very least he wasn't really lucid and wasn't able to do his duties as king. And so his son, the prince, became the Prince Regent, who was the one essentially in power because the king could not be, but even though the king was still alive. So that's why it's called the Regency era. Now, that was in England. You might also, if you're researching this time, it might be called the Empire era. That's more in France, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it might also be called the Federalist era, and that was more in the United States. And it just kind of coincides with what's going on in those countries at that time. So in the US, you can guess the Federalist era, this was the kind of the beginning of our democracy around the year 1800. And that also coincides with not just the fashion, but the architecture and the way that things were made at the time too. So usually these eras aren't just fashion, it kind of touches everything that's going on at that time. But usually people refer to this time as the Regency era because England became kind of the fashion capital of the world. And normally people think that it would have been France, but what was happening in France was a revolution. And so around 1800, Napoleon actually declared himself emperor, hence the empire outfit, the empire style dress. And so Napoleon became emperor. It was a lot of time of changing things. And so before that, France had kind of fallen off as the fashion icon of the world, and England had taken its place. And then we kind of start to see that shift a little bit too. So I wanted to show you where the fashion sort of came from and then where it went in this period. And I'm going to call it the Regency period because that kind of covers the largest amount, and it's sort of what we know it the best as. So I like this picture here that I have. I'm going to show it to you. It was a satirical cartoon at the time because this period kind of starts in the 1790s and goes until about the 1820s, and then we start going into what we would call the Victorian era. And so in the 1790s, what happened was the fashion started to be this kind of neoclassical celebration where people wanted to look a lot like the statues from Rome and Greece and antiquity, the ancient statues. So they wanted to look like a statue come to life. And you can see that in every single aspect. Like if you look at the dresses, they're almost like, not togas, but they have that kind of flowy feeling. They've got the higher waistline. And you're supposed to even have like your accessories are supposed to kind of mimic what these statues had too. There was even a trend for a little bit where some of the ladies would get their dress wet and put it on, so it would be kind of clingy and kind of look like that marble, but apparently that only happened in France, never in England, of course. But I have this picture here that compares let's see, it's from 1556 to 1796, so 200 years, and they're looking at each other just in horror. There you can see where the 1556 is, they're done up. They've got all this sort of thing in the back there, and they've got the corset, and their dress is really hooped out. And then the contrast to 1796 is like this lady who's in this kind of sheer muslin tunic kind of dress. So they're looking at each other saying too much and too little, or summer clothing for these years. And I just thought that was great, that was a cartoon that was created at the time where they're just like, oh, you look terrible. Oh, you look terrible. and that was kind of the expectation. So one of the big things that happened, here I have a picture of even just 1787, and when I do pictures, I really like to try and take pictures from the time period, not necessarily what we have in museums like the dresses, but like the paintings. So this painting is from 1787. And you can see a couple things here. Number one, you can see the dress, it's corseted. She has a very small stomach that gets corseted and tied down there. And in this very poofy skirt, and that's like very much the kind of revolutionary period that we would call in America, but also like maybe we're used to that like Marie Antoinette kind of outfit, I guess, from France and in Britain too. And one of the biggest changes in dresses that happened between just like 10 years actually was that the corset really loosened up, that it became a lot more about comfort, a lot more about the female body, not about, you know, tightening in. And the dresses actually stopped like being kind of tied in the front or like put together in the front, and instead buttoned down the back. And so you can see in that picture, like that shows it all. 1787, everything's in the front. She has a corset on, very different. And just 10 years later, or actually less than 10 years, 1795, here's a painting. And she really does. She looks like she is a statue come to life. She has this really beautiful white dress on that has, you know, a couple of accents, but it's quite plain compared to some of the outfits before. And that was really what the Regency period brought in. And the empire waist is the waist that kind of comes up pretty tall there. It kind of gets to the smallest part of your waist. And again, we're talking about female fashion today. Join us Fridays to talk about men's fashion. We're not just going to leave the men out, but female fashion is, you know, what we like to talk about as female. And we'll have a gentleman coming in on Fridays to talk about men's fashion. So the empire waist, again, that was because Napoleon declared himself emperor, so there was now a French empire, and his wife Josephine was actually also a fashion icon too. And so a lot of these trends that started happening were because of her. Now it did tend to be white, because the clothes tended to be white, because if you look at these ancient statues, they're white. And even though today you and I know that all of them maybe were painted these kind of almost garish colors, actually, that these marble buildings and figurines and whatnot from the ancient period were actually painted in all of these vibrant colors, but that faded over time, and they left these white pristine things. And so that's what people really emulated. They decided to go with this new kind of fabric, muslin, that was a lot more available to them, and it was very sheer, and it just like kind of flowed. And so that was the style. You could, however, go with some pastel colors, especially during the day if you decided that you wanted to go out and promenade, for example. And you can see, well, we've got someone right here who's promenading. Yes, so that would have been appropriate. Also, the white color, that nice pure white, was more for the younger ladies too, who were maybe looking to get married. And the more darker colors or other type of colors are more for the older ladies who were already married or who weren't really, you know, looking anymore at that time. Also, Greek hairstyles came back too, because again, it's wanting these figurines to come to life. So you've got the tunic and the silhouette, but you also have the hairstyles. So if you've ever seen like a movie from back then, they have these like really, really curly ringlets, and that's because it's styled after Greek, after the statues. So that's where that comes from too, which is all pretty interesting and kind of crazy. Let's see, they had bare arms, which was kind of a big deal as well, like that you could show off your arms. And usually it was a square neck at the top, although you could do V-neck as well. That would be appropriate too. So the empire silhouette, which is the one that comes up and gets kind of that smallest part, at its height, it was just really tall. It was really high up there. And it started to kind of drop back down as we kind of go through the Regency period. By the late Regency period, it's kind of at a more normal level. I have a really wonderful picture here from 1817. So we're jumping a little bit from, when was our last one? 1795 to 1817. And it's of a ball, and it's got all these ladies and gentlemen, and they're dancing. And you can see, though, that the ladies are mainly in white, and that would have been appropriate for a ball. You pretty much always had a white dress for these balls. But the waist is really high, if you can see that. I'll try and get closer. The waist is still really high. It's in 1817. And you can see the hemline on these dresses, too, is actually also kind of high. And that was mainly because, well, you're in England, you're wearing white. It's kind of muddy there, and it's kind of wet. And so that hemline actually came up a little bit. And so people would dance and be able to move around a little bit more freely. And you could even see their shoes. That was okay. And the hemline also kind of went up and down, though, too, as the period went on. One kind of fun thing that happened, though, was the men's style at this time. Like there was no parallel to the British men's style, the gentlemen in Britain. They were the top in the world, even for France. They kind of were the trendsetters. And it actually, at this time, too, started to go back to France being the trendsetters for women. And part of that is because of Napoleon. He said, okay, we're going to put a lot more money into fashion and like revitalize the French fashion economy that had been really decimated because of the revolution. And what happened was he put a lot of money into like French lace, for example. That became this hot commodity. He also he made a law or made a rule that you couldn't wear the same dress more than twice if you were going out in public, and so you had to have a lot of turnover there. And they also said that he would like block up the fireplaces in some of the palaces so that the ladies would be kind of cold and would need more clothes, and that kind of like revitalized the economy too, because now you have all these undergarments that you have to wear as well. And actually this type of dress, the empire dress, that is again typically made out of muslin, it could be other fabrics like lawn fabric, but usually it was this very, very light fabric. You would have like one layer underneath in the summer, but again, England is kind of chilly. And so you would have to have a lot of undergarments there in order to just be comfortable just going out and about. So usually, again, the dresses themselves were white typically, especially for the younger ladies, but you could accessorize with a lot of different colors. And so you could have a belt or a sash or something like that, a different color. This dress here is pretty plain. This would probably just be for a day dress, not necessarily an evening dress. But you can start to add like lace around it, and you can get like maybe pops of color that way. But the biggest way they got their color was actually by their outer garments, so like the coat. And the coats were usually really beautifully tailored, always at the top, long sleeves usually. Of course, they could be shorter in the summertime. But that was where the color really started to come in these different styles. So as we carry on in the Regency period, that waistline that was really, really, really tall or really high up starts to drop again. And I have this beautiful picture from 1823. So our last one was 1817. So we've got about 6 years here of her. And you can see her waist on there is a little bit more natural, I think. It's not as high up. It's a little bit more, hits her at a really flattering spot. And it's a beautiful color dress too. And so the style again starts to evolve and to change depending on France. And France, oh, I forgot to add this too. Napoleon actually put a stop on import of fabric from Britain. And so France had to rely on themselves or finding new ways, new avenues to get their fabric. And so France was actually the one too who said, okay, we need silk. Silk is where we're going to get our fabric. And so silk came in a lot of different colors, was very rich, right? And so the French fashion, again, kind of started to surpass the British fashion, at least for the women, because they had to work with what they had, and what they had was just really nice things, actually. So I did want to mention, too, even though the king was incapacitated, his wife, Queen Charlotte, who we bring this up a lot, but if you've seen Bridgerton, Queen Charlotte in it, she has a very different style than kind of all the rest of the characters in it. And it's because she was actually not really a fashion influencer like Napoleon's wife Josephine was, but she was, she preferred to wear the style of her youth, which was very much more like that first picture I showed you that had the corset and the wider hips and everything at the bottom. And so if you've seen that movie, that's why her clothes look so different, because she's not really up with the fashion. She's more comfortable in the things that she grew up wearing, which kind of makes sense. I feel like maybe we all have family members that are a little bit like that. So yeah, it's really an interesting style. I like it a lot. It's not necessarily one that it comes and goes, I think, over time. I think a lot of our clothes, we do have that more empire waist where it's a little bit higher, and like just fashion today kind of takes it from there and goes with it. And then after this, we start having the more corseted look that we're a little bit more familiar with in American history. I feel like this period of fashion in American history is really overlooked a lot, because we go from these just like beautiful gowns that we saw in like revolutionary America, and then we kind of skip and suddenly it's like ball gowns and hoop skirts. But actually there was this really beautiful period of time where we had this silhouette, the empire waist silhouette, and you got to accessorize with all of these different items. And that was here in the US too, but the US was not really a fashion leader at the time. We kind of just took our cues from England and from France, and then we did a lot of trading because we were a country that was just beginning, just beginning. And so all of those trade routes and everything too were beginning as well. And so we were still really dependent on these other countries for all of our imports and imported goods. And so the clothes kind of reflected that too, and maybe didn't have as nice a fabric quite yet, but that would change over the next not decade, over the next 100 years or so, century. So very interesting. Again, we are doing fashion all month long in March, and so if you enjoy talking about this like we do, please come back and check out what we're doing. We'll talk about men's fashion on Friday. And next week will be the early Victorian fashion too. So yeah, I didn't even get to talk, I forgot about these things too. But we've got our ribbons and all the things that we can add to our dress to kind of make it ours. And so if you've seen like shows where they are very into getting their new ribbons and whatnot, well, that's because if you were a gentle lady or like of the higher class, that was kind of all you could do. It was improper to do anything that wasn't like a social event or like fashion for these ladies. And so like getting new ribbons and like sewing and doing these beautiful things, that was a way of expressing yourself. And so that's just kind of a fun little thing too, where this was actually a really important part for their everyday life. But anyway, hopefully we'll see you next week where we talk about early Victorian fashion and how it changed from this silhouette to something very different. So we'll see you then. Thank you.